just how did adorable baby Steve Irwin go from a typical human to one who spent his days diving from perfectly safe boats into croc-infested waters? Well, I'm glad you asked, because today we're going to be covering the heartwarming story of the life of Steve Irwin. In the early 1970s, Irwin's family moved from the suburbs of Melbourne, where he was born in 1962 and where his father had worked as, of all things, a plumber, to Queensland, where he, along with his wife, founded the Beerwah Reptile Park. Initially, the Irwins, which consisted of Bob, Lynn, Steve, and Steve's siblings, Joy and Mandy, lived in an RV, but Bob soon used his plumbing and construction skills to build the family a shed to poop in and later a house to call home. During this time, Steve was educated on all things crocodile, helping his mother care for sick animals and his father wrangle ones that were causing trouble. For anyone curious, trouble could be anything from encroaching on private land to trying to eat people. And that begs the question, why was a small child helping their father relocate potentially man-eating crocodiles in the first place? Well, to help the government, of course. You see, when Bob Irwin set up the Beerwah Reptile Park, one of the stated goals was to assist with the protection of Australia's wildlife by relocating problem animals on behalf of the government or private individuals who would have otherwise killed them. For the most part, this involved simply moving the animals far away from humans, but in cases where the animal was injured or posed a significant risk to others, it would be relocated to the Beerwah Reptile Park for its own protection and then used as an educational tool, in essence becoming an ambassador for its species rather than a pair of shoes or a handbag. As a child, Irwin would assist his father in this, by his own admission, stating he wrestled his first croc at 9 years old. Clearly a late bloomer. In this case, he popped his crocodile cherry by leaping directly onto its back from a dinghy and then dragging it out of the water, a technique he would refine over the years and would become his trademark move. As to this, in the many interviews Irwin gave about the topic, his general technique for ensuring optimum crocodile capture and minimum being turned into crocodile poo was more or less as follows. The first step is sizing up the crocodile, a difficult task considering in many situations the crocodile will be submerged beyond full visibility. Fortunately for Irwin, there's apparently a fairly simple way to tell how big a crocodile is, shining a torch directly in its eyes, which will result in a telltale glint that a seasoned expert like Irwin could use to roughly gauge the size of the entire animal. We'll just have to take his word on that. Irwin further stated he'd generally only attempt to single-handedly capture a crocodile under 6 feet in length. Why? Well, past that length, he'd be unable to fully control the tail, which on larger crocodiles can strike with the force of a leathery organic sledgehammer when the animal is thrashing about, which it's obviously going to do when someone leaps onto its back. Thus, if it were larger than that, Irwin would instead opt to lure the animals into a specially constructed crocodile-shaped cage with food before subduing it, or if the animal needed to be restrained then and there, getting a helper, usually his wife Terri, to focus on restraining the tail while he grabbed the more dangerous end. Irwin's second crocodile wrestling tip was to immediately seek to force the creature's mouth shut, which is apparently relatively easy, as while the muscles used to close its mouth are incredibly powerful, the ones used to open it are relatively weak. So weak, in fact, that a typical man could forcibly keep the jaws shut with their bare hands, provided they also possess the necessary set of lead-lined balls required to actually leap onto the crocodile in the first place. At this point, depending on the size of the animal, it can be further restrained by either the person wrestling it or a helper, which generally involves binding the creature's mouth and/or legs. Alternately, you can simply lie atop the crocodile until it tires and mostly gives up, allowing it to be maneuvered more easily. This was a technique Irwin would adopt with particularly large crocodiles, usually employing an entire team to dogpile the creature until it was fatigued enough to be handled without risk of injury to itself or to those trying to help it. As mentioned, Irwin was entirely self-taught when it came to handling crocodiles and other similarly deadly creatures, and many biographies of the man and interviews with those who knew him personally talk about the fact that he had a seeming sixth sense for wildlife honed over a lifetime, which is why he appeared so natural and at ease handling even the most dangerous creatures. As the man himself would note, snakes are very instinctive to me. I've been handling them since before I could walk. Going back to his formative years in school itself, this was seemingly uneventful, save for all the time off Irwin took due to saving animals, and on the side, he was reportedly also an excellent rugby player, playing for his high school team, the Caloundra Sharks. As you could probably guess, given that Irwin wrestled half-ton crocodiles for fun, he was apparently pretty good at tackling and bringing down humans as well. This isn't to say that he was impossible to beat, though, and there is a popular story told about the time Irwin visited the training grounds of the Brisbane Broncos and run afoul of one of the most dominant players the sport of rugby has ever seen. Shane Webker. Irwin asked if he could attempt to tackle Webker to see if his skills wrangling crocodiles would translate to wrangling a beast of a man. For anyone familiar with Webker or the sport of rugby, this request was akin to asking Mike Tyson in his prime to punch you in the face to see whether or not you could take it. In the end, Webker complied with the request and ultimately tackled Irwin like the World Cup was on the line. To Irwin's credit, while he utterly failed in bringing Webker down, he did manage to do something very few men tackled by him at full force were able to do: stand up afterwards and smile and shake his hand. Getting back to Irwin's post-school life, he spent the first decade after schooling assisting his father on behalf of the Australian government with the removal and relocation of troublesome wildlife to the family zoo and elsewhere, which on the former rebranded to the Queensland Reptile and Fauna Park around the 1980s. During this period, Irwin also became something of a local celebrity by taking part in the crocodile feeding shows that became a staple draw of the Beerwah Reptile Park. Finally, in 1991, the senior Irwin gifted the park in its entirety to his son. Shortly after assuming ownership, Irwin met his aforementioned future wife, an American named Terri Raines. According to Terri, who at the time was a conservationist with a specific interest in the care of predatory animals, she first met Irwin whilst visiting the Queensland Reptile and Fauna Park after hearing about the park's conservation efforts, which of course piqued her interest enough to make a point of visiting the park as part of her trip to Australia to learn from the man himself. When asked to later describe the moment she first saw Steve, Terri notes that he was, quote, the most incredible man I've ever seen. A thought that was quickly interrupted by the second, less fun intrusive thought of, well, he's probably married. As for Steve's perspective on the meeting, he describes the moment they first met as literally love at first sight. At the time, he was feeding a half-ton crocodile called Agro, as you do, because, oh yes, the pair met whilst Irwin was in the middle of a scheduled crocodile feeding show. But he claims he was so taken with Terri that he briefly forgot about the near 15-foot crocodile trying to eat him. He thus quickly wraps up the show and approached Terri, who'd waited around afterwards to introduce herself, at which point a park employee took a photo of the pair. As Terri would recount in an episode of The Crocodile Hunter, this photo became one of her most treasured possessions, as it quite literally captured the moment they first met. And it just gets more adorable from there. For the rest of the story, we turn to Terri's autobiography, in which she explains that while their first meeting was where the spark between them was created, she was unsure if their attraction was mutual. A few days later, Irwin invited her to return and see some of his team's conservation work firsthand. Smooth. During the second meeting, Terri tried to surreptitiously figure out whether Irwin was in a relationship, first by trying to spot a wedding ring, which Irwin didn't wear, something she didn't think was concrete proof because she presumed, quite accurately we might add, that a man in his line of work likely wouldn't wear jewelry as it would pose a potential risk to any animal he handled. When the pair later married, neither wore a wedding band for this exact reason. Following this, Terri tried asking pointed questions about Steve's life, which he happily answered and revealed a whole host of things, like the fact that he literally lived at the park and had been caring for animals his entire life. Finally, Irwin, seemingly picking up what she was putting down, answered her unspoken question without prompting by excitedly jumping to his feet during the conversation and asking if she'd like to meet his girlfriend. Terri feigned enthusiasm and told Irwin she'd love to. It was then that he stood up and called for his girlfriend, Sue, his pet dog, who bounded toward him and leapt into his arms. Double smooth. According to Terri, this is the exact moment she fell in love with Irwin. According to Steve, for him it was when he first laid eyes on her. What followed was a whirlwind romance where Irwin laid on the Australian charm as thick as he could spread it, first taking Terri to an all-you-can-eat seafood buffet and tricking her into thinking he could smell when ducks were close by. Supposedly an old bushman's trick right out of Crocodile Dundee that involves telling an attractive lady you can somehow sense that an animal is nearby and then revealing the location of said animal to the astounded and presumably very impressed woman. Irwin would later admit to Terri that he couldn't actually smell ducks at all and that the restaurant he'd taken her to was near a duck pond that he'd played at as a child. Needless to say, in the face of this beast of a man with a heart of gold and moves that make even the most hetero of males want to have his babies, Terri didn't stand a chance, and Steve was by all accounts just as impressed with his new counterpart. The pair were engaged within 4 months of meeting and later married in Terri's home state of Oregon before returning to Australia. One noteworthy thing about Owen's marriage is that it is one of the few times in his entire clothed adult life that he didn't wear his trademark khakis, opting to wear a tuxedo instead. In search of other instances where he wore literally anything else because we're nerdy like that and not because our team of authors totally have a thing for Owen, resulting in the necessity for a pact to clear each other's search histories in the event of our deaths, it was for science, no other reason. In any event, we scoured more hours of Steve Irwin's footage than some might say was warranted, and we could find only a single other instance where he's not wearing those khakis. a 2005 interview with Conan O'Brien in which he wore jeans, which was immediately picked up on by the host, who notes how weird it is to see Irwin in something other than shorts. For anyone curious, the reason Irwin was wearing jeans instead of his trademark shorts is because he was in the middle of filming a show where animals underwent surgery and the vets forbade him from wearing anything short for hygienic reasons. Besides that instance, his wedding and a handful of appearances where wearing shorts simply wouldn't have been safe, like trips to the Arctic and desert where Irwin absolutely had to cover up to protect the elements from the glorious sight of his khaki lower half, he always wore his trademark shorts. Hell, we even found footage of Irwin surfing in his khakis, which is incredible for both that and the fact that midway through hanging 10, he spotted a sea snake in the water and immediately stopped what he was doing to put it on his head. As you do. While it was often rumored that Irwin was contractually obligated to wear the outfit for branding reasons, the truth is it was simply what he felt most comfortable wearing when handling animals, and since he was pretty much always handling animals, remember, he literally lived in a zoo, it basically became his default attire 99% of the time, up to and including the birth of his own daughter and at other people's weddings, which, yes, he attended in his trademark attire. As for why he didn't like wearing a suit, Irwin summed it up best when he told an interview from the Northern Echo, quote, "The scariest moment of my entire life was my wedding, where I had to wear a tuxedo and this thing around my neck. I would sooner take on a boa constrictor. I was so scared, sweat was running down my hands. Yes, mate, I've worn a suit and will never do it again. I've learned from my mistake." Perhaps nothing sums up how committed to the bit Irwin and his family were more than the fact that following his passing, TV executives felt they needed to update the family's look when the whole Irwin clan revealed that they literally had no idea what to wear besides Steve's go-to outfit. At the entire family's insistence, this overhaul didn't see anyone stop wearing khaki, but they did get better tailored outfits and more modern haircuts to reflect the times. However, in keeping with Irwin's memory and personal sense of style, the Queensland Reptile and Fauna Park, or Australia Zoo as it's now known, sells the oversized variant he favoured as a souvenir for fans. Speaking of the name change of that zoo, this occurred around the time Terri and Irwin married and the Crocodile Hunter show came into existence. Proving they were a match made in heaven, after marrying in 1992, the pair opted to, instead of going on a honeymoon, travel Australia rescuing crocodiles, filming the whole thing for posterity, and with the hopes of turning it into a documentary to raise awareness for their conservation efforts. This footage was ultimately edited into a documentary for Australian TV by a guy called John Stainton. While this documentary was warmly received, it didn't really receive much international recognition. However, Stainton was convinced that Irwin could be a star if the right people saw what he was up to, frequently traveling with a beat-up VHS tape of Irwin's antics that he'd show to anyone and everyone who'd listen, usually telling them that it featured, quote, footage of this crazy guy in Australia who goes out and captures crocodiles and relocates them. He's been making these home videos, and I think it would be a good show. As a reminder, the tape Stainton was talking about was Irwin's honeymoon. In any event, a copy of this tape eventually caught the eye of the Discovery Network executives in 1996, around the time that they were toying with the idea of launching an entirely new channel that revolves solely around animal-themed programming. Animal Planet. To test out whether Irwin would be a good fit for a show of his own, Discovery sent a small team of cameramen to Australia to basically just follow him around during his day-to-day life and see what they could capture, as well as to size up the man himself. According to most everyone who took part in this test, it was clear that Irwin was born to be in front of the camera, and his natural charisma and genuineness that had won over the heart of his wife was immediately evident to all. As for what they shot, the nature of Irwin's work resulted in such a wide variety of footage that some of it ended up being used seasons later, and a large amount was directly the result of Irwin just being himself. For example, there's a now iconic moment in The Crocodile Hunter where Irwin tells his crew to stop the car because there's a big-ass snake by the side of the road. While many assumed this moment was scripted in some way, according to camera operator Steve Elkins, the whole thing was entirely spontaneous. Irwin really did just happen to spot a cool snake by the side of the road and told the crew to pull over to make sure that it was okay. Something, as discussed, he'd been doing since his schoolboy days. It was also around this time that Irwin created some of his earliest die-hard fans and began to forge the legend of his impossibly massive cast-iron balls that could only be contained in his magical khakis. For instance, another story recounted by Elkin was when he was getting B-roll of a rescued mountain lion and the creature suddenly lunged at Elkin to attack. Before he could react, in a flash, Irwin had placed himself between Elkin and the lion. Irwin then stared down the creature until it backed away. Elkin would later recount, Irwin simply muttered after, I can't let you get hurt. As you might imagine, when the camera crew went back to Discovery, they were enthusiastic and didn't really have anything bad that they could say about this effortlessly badass human who at various points had done things like scaring off a black bear through sheer intimidation, or at one point dove into the water filled with cottonmouth snakes holding a camera after the cameraman tasked with the job admitted to being too scared to do it. Discovery were suitably impressed by these stories and the footage shot, editing it together with a bunch of footage they'd shot of the recently renamed Australia Zoo and the Irwin's own honeymoon footage to create what is now known as the Crocodile Hunter. The show was an immediate hit, catapulting Irwin to international superstardom, which he was always humble about, expressing in interviews that his only goal was simply to raise awareness about wildlife and its conservation. This isn't to say that Irwin didn't profit from the show or his countless TV appearances, and of course, his big screen debut in the Crocodile Hunter collision course, with Irwin having an estimated net worth of about $10 million at the time of his death, although noteworthy, much of that was tied up in real estate, and in particular, the Australia Zoo, which was also, remember, where he also lived and owned outright after being gifted it by his father in the 90s. Despite a rather sizable net worth, Irwin enjoyed few of the trappings of wealth you'd associate with a massive internationally recognized star. To quote the man himself, "I don't need a Ferrari, or a Rolex, or a gold-plated dunny seatmate. I live in a 3-bedroom brick home that I've always lived in. Every cent we earn from the Crocodile Hunter goes straight into conservation." Irwin's commitment to this ethos was such that even the massive fees he could command for appearances and cameos in other projects were generally donated to either a charity of his choosing or funneled directly back into Australia Zoo to fund it and its various conservation efforts. For example, Irwin is known to have licensed his image to the Australian government for use on posters to raise awareness about the country's quarantine procedures, with all funds for this going to various animal-related causes. The same is true for other commercial endeavors Irwin took part in. As a brief aside, one of the more obscure fundraising efforts Irwin hoped to take part in was a charity fistfight against another celebrity. You see, Irwin was a big fan of combat sports, to the point that his personal bodyguard for many years, yes, the man who wrestled crocodiles had a bodyguard for some reason, Carl Noak, was hired purely because he had a background in martial arts and Irwin wanted someone to teach him. And who better than the man he was literally paying to follow him around all day? In any event, according to Noak, Irwin was a natural at fighting, and eventually he was hired to be Irwin's full-time trainer rather than his bodyguard, when it became evident that the man who suplexed half-ton crocodiles for a living and was otherwise beloved by most humans probably didn't need help defending himself. During this period, Irwin repeatedly pitched the idea of a celebrity MMA match to producers and television execs that he could bend the ear of, with all the proceeds going to charity. However, the idea was shot down every time as they were worried Irwin would get hurt. Remember, these same executives were paying him to take part in a show where he routinely put deadly snakes on his head. Irwin, nonetheless, kept up with training and even got as far as pitching some names to execs, one of which was Wesley Snipes, after Irwin learned that the actor was similarly a keen martial artist. This time, the idea was ultimately scrapped when Irwin learned he was half a foot taller than Snipes. Irwin was 6'2", Snipes stands at 5'9", and deemed that any fight wouldn't be fair. Yes, you heard that right. Steve Irwin literally turned down the chance to fight Blade because he didn't think it would be fair. For Blade. Another name floated by Irwin before the idea was abandoned entirely was Vin Diesel, who stood closer to Irwin's own height. Diesel's around 6 feet tall and had similar action movie chops. According to Noak, Irwin went to see Vin Diesel vehicle The Pacifier multiple times purely to size up Diesel before he was finally convinced to drop the idea by executives and go back to supposedly safer pastime of wrestling crocodiles. And that was basically what Irwin spent the rest of his time doing between various media appearances until his untimely death in 2006. According to those present when Irwin was fatally struck in the heart by a stingray whilst filming footage for a documentary on the Barrier Reef, his last words were quite fitting for a man as genuine and plain-spoken as Irwin was. He simply stated, "I'm dying, mate." The outpouring of grief following Irwin's passing is hard to quantify. But as a final thing, we think sums up his life, and the kind of man he was, is that Irwin's father, Bob, upon being offered a state funeral for Australia's favourite son, turned the offer down, telling the Australian Prime Minister that his son would much rather be remembered as an ordinary bloke. Irwin was ultimately buried in a private service in the one place he felt most at home, the Australia Zoo. Thank you for watching.